Hello and welcome to The Found Cause, where we have found our cause and serve the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm Michael, the man behind the machine, and to my right, your left is...
Sebastian, the bookkeeper.
And over the airwaves, Prince of the Air, it's none other than...
Theodore, under the PC, the person of Christ.
All right, and to any of our viewers coming from Paulogia's channel, welcome once again. Thanks for showing up. You probably didn't see this young man, you didn't see this young man over the airwaves last time, but actually, the reason we're bringing him on, Theodore's what do we call you, like a guest theologian on our podcast?
Nothing. Maybe a founding member,
yeah.
But now just a guest commentator.
Yes, and to his credit, and the reason we're particularly having him on this response video, though it's going to be short, is that Theodore was the one that found Paulogia's channel for us and was suggested we do a reaction to him. So, and Theodore's the one that told us we had a response video from Paulogia on the day that he responded. So, credit to Theodore. He's a little bit more invested, I guess, in Paulogia's channel than me, maybe a little bit, and Sebastian. But of course, we've listened to Paulogia's stuff, and we want to give a metered reaction here. So, to get started with said reaction, we have about 14 points from Paulogia's video. We're going to try to be as brief as possible. Hopefully hold this to 20 minutes, which we never do. But we want to go through, keep it level-headed, not a lot of smirk. When we do this normally, we usually have fun. We're doing a podcast reaction video, so apologies for the glib attitude that some people were picking up on. But quite honest, I think there's a little bit of the whole damned if you do, damned if you don't attitude in some of that, right? Like if we were super serious, we'd be one of those like Ken Ham types that is too serious and doesn't know how to make light of things. And if we're super fun, suddenly we're, not taking these debates seriously. So whatever, we'll try to keep it even keel here and go through these 14 points. Any comments you guys want to make before we start going through? I think one of the main things that I want to get across as clear before we go through this is that there are presuppositions on our part, no doubt. Right? A lot of people have a problem with that. They have a problem with that we're presupposing that the Bible is true, but I'll suggest that everybody comes into a debate with a presupposition, whether they believe in God or not, if they're coming into it with a bias. So what we won't be doing here, and again, this might upset some of you and think it's not logical or whatever, I think it's perfectly logical. Everybody comes into a debate with presuppositions, and we're not going to leave the presupposition that the Bible is true. However, that doesn't mean that we're going to disregard logic and disregard evidences and disregard points that Paulogia made. We're going to look at all of them. So it's not like we're going to shut our ears to things that we disagree with. Here in this podcast, we're all about looking at other people's arguments and making sure we're not just glibly excusing them. I know we did some of that in the reaction video. It's going to happen. I'm sure I'm not perfect, neither Sebastian nor Theodore, but we'll do our best to seriously engage the stuff that Paulogia talked about. He was gracious enough to do that with our podcast. I mean, watch an hour-long podcast, he does that, but we are not going to leave the presupposition that we believe the Bible. So don't think we're coming into some neutral ground, but we will try to engage things reasonably and not just pull the Bible tells me so card. But I mean, we do believe in the Bible. There's no getting around that. Again, any stuff before I start going down the list?
Just as a quick reference, for any belief system, whether you're atheist, whether you're Buddhist or Muslim, you're coming in with that presupposition that worldview is how you see your life, you see other people, you see everything, how you interpret things. So even atheists, even Christians, Muslims, as I said, we all have it. Just to establish that.
And we've talked about it on this podcast before, so I won't go over it. But yes, that's our general principle. So I'll be going in basically chronological order. So if you see linked in the description, we've got the original response video to our response video from Paulogia. Now we're going 3 layers deep in the inception. So I'm going to be going chronologically through that response video and just take a couple of the points. So point number 1, and Paulogia makes this plain. I think this is going to be a disconnect. He did a little graphic of a plug unplugged on this point too. Mm-hmm. These are his claims. He's not refuting Christian claims to truth, but he's rather refuting facts about Christianity, or rather the founding of the Christian religion. Important point here that I think he makes is that he really holds to, and he didn't make it clear in his short little video, which I don't blame him too much for, but he actually only believes facts about Christianity are the 7 undisputed epistles of Paul. So that's definitely where we disconnect. Me, Sebastian, Theodore, is that we would hold to the entirety of canon scripture to be facts about at least the founding of Christianity. So even if you disagree about the content wherein, of course you do, atheists, right? They claim that God has come as a person and did these miraculous things. Mm-hmm. I understand that you disagree with the things that happen, but we would say that they are genuine documents from genuine believers who genuinely believe these things were happening. So they should be held in the same regard as what Paul wrote in his 7 epistles as far as what he thought was happening. So whether, again, you agree with what he thought was happening was really happening, like Paulogia claims that he came under some sort of stress-induced delusion, which is apparently common and can happen to people. Regardless of what you believe about that scenario, we would hold that all the ones that are in canon, all the books that are in canon, are from time period Christians who were there, who were actually claiming these things at the time. And so their calls to there being witnesses and go ask people about these things, their calls to having interviewed people that had been at places are genuine. They're not pseudo-bibliographical. They're not pseudo after-the-fact legends per se, like the legend of Paul Bunyan would be, or others like that, where those aren't claims to have seen things. I guess some legends are claims to have seen things, but most of those legends, like Paul Bunyan, are just spitting that something happened, which is the way most legends are portrayed anyways. We would hold to all the Bible being true.
That people are claiming, I saw this with my own eyes. So you may disagree that these people actually saw those things, but in reality what they're saying is we're gonna communicate what we saw.
Now, we are familiar with the debates around the only accepting the 7 undisputed letters of Paul. So I understand the debates. Richard Carrier is a pretty modern, famous atheist who essentially bases his whole mythological argument that Jesus is a mythical character based off of only using the 7 epistles. And we won't dredge on it too much right now, but because we could spend the whole episode talking about just that point. But I do want to say that we're familiar with the arguments. I didn't know that Paulogia was exclusively doing that, but you did hear me say repeatedly in the last reaction video that he's listening to liberal scholars. And what I mean by liberal, not just to be derogatory, but I mean people who don't believe that the whole of the New Testament is genuine Christian teaching, that it's added teaching from Christians, sure, but not from genuine time period Christians. So we would hold that that is an incorrect view. Again, we could go on why that is. I think undoubtedly will. We have it scheduled in our podcast to go over that specific topic, but again, not to dwell on it, but that will be a natural disconnect between us and Paulogia's claims. And I think that's the disingenuousness that I had been talking about previously, was that when you don't take the whole of the New Testament as actual Christian beliefs, right, that are not quote unquote facts about the founding of Christianity, then you're not really engaging our beliefs. So I know we're Christians, so maybe your video is not for us, Paulogia, but the thought is that your video could possibly be going out to Christians, and you're suggesting that it's a more plausible scenario, your scenario of Paul and Peter and John being some disciples of Jesus, and Peter and Paul at least had these visions that might have been stress-induced. Your whole theory there is supposed to be plausible to Christians, and I would say it's not really engaging the Christian belief about what happened, or at least the whole Christian story about what happened. It's a different story, so I wouldn't really call it a argument against how the Christian story happened. It's more of a suggestion about history that we don't even agree that on those historical facts. Like we believe that the Gospels were written, most of them at least, contemporary to the death of Jesus, right afterwards, right? They're not later additions. So again, a different Christian argument than we're presenting. Second point, Paul Bunyan skeptics, so his allusion to Paul Bunyan, right? Skeptics only need to support the claim that it's a legend, not the details themselves. He alludes to not having to support why Babe the ox would be blue, because all you really need to do as a skeptic of the Paul Bunyan story is claim that it's a legend, and you need somebody to try to disprove that it's a legend. So the conversion into Christianity is that Christian needs facts outside the legend to support it not being a legend. And so that's, again, same as point number 1. The disconnect here is that we believe, just like Paulogia believes, that 7 of the epistles of Paul are legitimate. We believe that the entire New Testament is legitimate documents, and therefore we think it's all fair game to talk about the things that happened in those documents. Again, you can dispute whether they're false things that are happening in those documents, but at least that they're legitimate documents from the time.
Mm-hmm.
Third point, and here's another one that was getting lots of traction. Other religions have the same markers for origins as Christianity. So origins of Christianity are as discernible as knowing how an engine starts, for example. So he made an allusion in the episode, his small short one that we reacted to, that you could suppose that your car starts based on some magical pixie dust process, but we also have a better explanation for how your car starts, and that is the engine diagram, the physics behind it, right? And so a suggestion is that we know how religions start, and therefore we can find the markers of how other religions start in the Christian origin story and explain it away, just like we explain away Buddhism, Islam, whatever, other religions that we don't hold to.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that I would hold to the opinion that we said in the podcast, which is that Christianity does have unique origins. I think it is legitimately and significantly different than the origins of Islam, any polytheism belief, Mormonism, etc. Other religions that we wouldn't hold to have significant differences and important differences to the origins of Christianity that make Christianity's origin story actually unique. So, i.e., they're not explainable in the same way that an engine starting is explainable by the design of the engine.
Mm-hmm. And I would say, perhaps as a side comment, so you might say that, many people claim to be a Messiah. Well, that is correct. For other people that have claimed to be Messiah, like Simon in Perea, or even Moses of Crete, which came much later. He did a bunch of silly things that we have also covered in the podcast before. But no one contemporary to these individuals claimed that these messiahs, so-called, resurrected. So what I'm saying is that there's a clear distinction between the testimony regarding these individuals versus the one for Jesus. So it is significantly different when it comes to Christ. You may say that these claims are made up. Nonetheless, what we're saying, the claims exist.
Yeah, and I think the obvious line of logic from us and from Christian apologists in general is that because Christianity has claims like that would in theory be verifiable by people at the time, that it is awfully bold of Christianity to make claims like that when they are, at least in theory, verifiably false by people at the time. So if they could find Jesus' body, it'd be one way to verify it. Others, again, interviewing witnesses who supposed to have seen Jesus alive again after having seen him crucified. These are pretty verifiably false claims if you were somebody at the time of the Christian spreading, right, initially, whereas in other religions, usually they aren't verifiable. Mm-hmm. For example, a personal vision that somebody gets. I understand that there are personal visions that Christians get or Jews get in the Old Testament and some in the New Testament. So you might dispute those as being not solid supernatural evidences, but there are plenty of public events in Christianity that just aren't apparent in Islam or Buddhism and other things like that.
Right. Private revelation, for example, in the Quran for the Prophet Muhammad, or private revelation, for example, more contemporary, Joseph Smith, when he gets visited by an angel, as they claim.
Point number 4, contradicting story elements. So story elements from the New Testament that contradict Paulogia's claims. For example, Joseph of Arimathea bringing Jesus' body into the tomb, he claims that they're non-corroborated, and at least that they are legendary, right? That they're not to be taken as seriously. If not, their support for it being legendary. He suggested that the story of Joseph of Arimathea taking Jesus' body is a cover-up of sorts of the fact that people would be asking, why wasn't Jesus' body thrown into a ditch after he was crucified, right? And so we would counteract that by saying, I mean, you can claim whatever you want, right? You can claim that Joseph of Arimathea is a story, but it probably goes right back to the fact that we believe that the testimony of the Gospels is generally contemporary. They're at least beliefs of the early Christians, and not later additions, in some legendary sense. They're as factual as Paul's 7 epistles. So I think that just comes down to what books we're taking as quote-unquote Christian facts. Now, again, you might still argue that the authors of the Gospels made up this character. He's at least corroborated by the Gospels, but the fact that you won't take the Gospels as a legitimate literary source from the time is where our disconnect is. Point number 5, and this is kind of the theme of what I've been saying, but rejecting all but 7 of Paul's letters, if we honestly only have those to work off of, you really don't have much to say about Peter at all. Which is, I guess, why the story from Paulogia's vantage point is just that Peter was an apostle or a disciple of Jesus, and that Jesus died, because that's verifiable from other Roman sources, right? And so Peter must have been an influential disciple, because Paul talks about having to go talk with him and essentially get his approval, and therefore he must be a prominent post-death of Christ pusher of the Christian faith. We don't really know what he taught. Maybe it was misconstrued into what the Gospels had to say. There's nothing to go off there. So no wonder you can dismiss him as, you can kind of mold Peter into whoever you want if you just have the reference to him being a disciple from Paul. So again, not really meaningfully engaging with the Christian story there. Point number 6. Papias claims that Mark did not omit anything he heard, so it's likely not an abridged gospel. This is a off point. I guess I maybe belabored it in the reaction before, but I had suggested that Mark is shorter, possibly to be an abridged version of Matthew's gospel if it was indeed second, so that it was more easily shareable, could have opportunities for people to share the gospel, their own experiences of the risen Christ after it, because it ends abruptly without Jesus' resurrection if you knock off the pseudo ending of Mark. So I'll say It's not a hill I'm going to stand and die on. Like if Mark really was the first gospel, I mean, it could be. I'm not saying that my theory there is supportable by facts. It's just a suggestion. It's not my suggestion. I've heard theologians like James White suggest the same thing before, but I'm not going to die on that hill. I will say that Papias claiming that Mark did not omit anything is actually talking about his being the scribe for Peter, so he didn't admit anything that he was told by Peter, and so I don't know that that's a legitimate way of saying it wasn't abridged. I don't think that really says anything about whether it was abridged or not. It just says that he wrote down what Peter told him. He wasn't editing what Peter told him. That's all. And I'll just keep trucking. So again, feel free to interrupt me, especially you, Theodore. you're just along for the ride anyways. You said you might not have much to say. 7.7. Peter could have been a lonely and bereaved person, since we don't take the gospel accounts as fact. Paulogia does not, and other scholars do not. That's going back to the point, right, that you can mold Peter into whoever you want him to be if you don't know anything about Peter, and all you know is that he's a disciple of Christ from Paul's epistles. We have more to talk about Peter than you do. That's just straight what it comes down to.
Hence the difference in approach. Yeah,
and therefore we would say he, likely at least, based on the Christian claims, is not a lonely and bereaved man. He had all the disciples with him, at least had his brother with him. Again, I don't know if Paulogia would suggest that Peter didn't have a brother, or we don't know if he had a brother because we only know his presence and livingness from the mention from Paul. But Peter in the Gospels, and I guess in Christian tradition, had a brother, Andrew, and one of the other apostles, so he'd at least have his brother. Point 8, Peter's sudden change is perfectly believable as a con act. So we had suggested that Peter's descriptions and the descriptions of Peter in the Gospels are not flattering, and therefore it's probably not likely that it's a self-aggrandizing belief he's pushing. He knows that Jesus was never resurrected, but he's trying to push this belief with all this non-flattering material he's got in himself, the fact that he doubted so often, that he's kind of a bozo in some of the scenarios, right? He doesn't understand often what Jesus is trying to teach, that he's not trying to make himself look good, and therefore it's probably real. Paulogia suggested that this is a classic con act thing to pretend like you were the skeptic, but now you've been convinced, and so it's all the more convincing is what sells it. Paulogia even gave himself as an example that he's an ex-Christian. The ex-Christian part of his testimony is what sells it. I would say it's kind of a contradicting version of Peter that would be doing both. So is he the lonely, bereaved Peter, or is he the con man Peter who's coming up with a false act of, I once was a skeptic and now I'm not? And honestly, Peter's story isn't really skeptic to non-skeptic. It's much more dumb believer to wise believer. He wasn't a skeptic of Christ before. He was one of Jesus' ardent followers. So his kind of bozoness isn't really the same thing as, I was once a doubter, but now I'm not. If anybody, Thomas, the apostle, would be that guy for that con act.
Mm-hmm. And also, you've probably already heard this before, that accepting the belief in Christ, you had nothing to gain. You had no fame, no power to gain based on the message of Christianity, which actually denounces worldly means. So I would just say, in comparison to other systems, you really don't have much to gain, considering all the embarrassing accounts that there of the apostles, like Peter making a fool of himself, and Paul also, having that shocking moment on his conversion. So there's a lot of embarrassing things that happened. Yeah, there really is. I don't think there was much to be gained. In fact, they died. They were martyred. So not much to be gained from that.
Now, of course, he's claiming they weren't martyred. He takes the most skeptical view, not surprisingly, of the martyrdom traditions of the apostles. Now, I understand even the Bible doesn't talk about the martyrdom of most all of the apostles, save for James, son of Zebedee, and Peter claims that he's about to die. Paul claims he's about to die in their letters. So again, there's not direct evidence from the Gospels themselves of the martyrdom of some of these apostles, but some of them did die for their faith, even within the Gospels. And I think, strangely, well, I guess not that strangely, the Gospels themselves, Acts I should say, talks about the death of James, the son of Zebedee. So that one's not even just a Christian tradition, it's straight in the text. Now, I understand Paulogia is rejecting Acts as a legitimate source, so take that as you may, but we would hold about the martyrdom of the apostles.
Yes. For another, not from the Bible source, the Epistle of Clement to the church in Corinth mentions the martyrdom of Peter and Paul after having suffered in their lives. So just a quick reference.
And even Paulogia admits that Peter, James, the son, brother of Jesus, and Paul all were likely martyred. He accepts those martyrdoms. And if those were all martyrs for the faith, he suggests Paul had a delusional experience, that PTSD style experience. He gave it some acronym I'm forgetting now, but illusion of the risen Christ. Same for Peter, supposedly. Or Peter was a con man, and in that case, he was dying for a con, which I don't think is a likely scenario. And then James, the brother of Jesus, was also deluded. Somehow, I assume Paulogia would suggest a similar way. He didn't offer that in the response, but again, strange that these men would be, if they were knowingly falsely spreading a false story about Christ, that they would go to their deaths for it, especially when they could easily modify their story to not be a trouble for the Roman authorities. And then equally, if they are believing a lie that they've been convinced of, I would wonder what very strong lie are they all believing in, again, to the point of death, especially James, the brother of Jesus, who I guess you would also suggest had some sort of post-guilt trip experience. I don't know what your suggestion would be there, Paulogia. Here's another point. Step number 9. Acts has 3 different conflicting stories of Paul's Damascus Road vision. Acts 9, Acts 22, and Acts 26 are all references to that Damascus Road vision, and Paulogia claims that they are contradicting. Now, of course, he also says that Acts isn't even a reliable source, so whatever, but if you did take Acts as a reliable source, then chapters 9, chapter 22, and chapter 26 show different versions of his Damascus Road vision. I don't know where you're getting this. You must be getting it from somewhere else, so I won't suggest that you're being disingenuous, but whoever your source is for that, where you've heard this before, I think is just not a very good source, because we have them. Even when you quoted them, it was apparent on your video, Paulogia, that they weren't contradicting. But Sebastian, you have them pulled up, don't you?
Yep, I have from 9, 22, and 26. I can quickly read them. So, as he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting," he replied. "Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." The men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They heard the sound, but did not see anyone.
Okay, so that last part's key. That's what he quoted on the podcast. They heard the sound, but didn't see anyone. Those with Paul heard the sound, but they didn't see anyone.
Yep, and then now from 22, I'll get to the part. "Who are you, Lord?" I asked after he gets shocked and whatnot. "I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting," he replied. "My companions saw the light, but they did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me." And 26. I was going to Damascus. Okay. About noon, King Agrippa, as I was on the road, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, blazing around me and my companions. We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goats." Then I asked, "Who are you, Lord?" "I am Jesus, whom you're persecuting," the Lord replied. "Now get up, stand on your feet. I've appeared to you and appointed you as a servant and witness, rescue you from your people and from the Gentiles."
Now, Theodore, I know you have a comment on these Acts passages. I think to those who are listening, especially if you're a Christian and you've heard these before, I don't think they're conflicting. Do you want to touch on why they're not conflicting?
Sure. So the first one, Acts 9, is they heard the sound but did not see anyone. Acts 22 is they saw light. Light is not anyone in particular. And in Acts 9, he probably said they did not see anyone because it was a voice that spoke to Paul, but they heard the sound, the voice, something they did not understand, that they did not see anyone. So Paulogia mentioned for Acts 26, quote, "Only Paul sees and hears," but it's evident with the whole context that you read, Sebastian, that even the people with Paul experienced the event as well.
Yeah, and so again, Paulogia claims that there are 3 different accounts. That one is where Paul sees but doesn't hear, where his companions see but don't hear, and then one is where they hear but don't see, and one is where they do neither. I think it's just a strange reading of the text. Again, I won't assert any motive or state of mind when Paulogia was reading it. I assume he got it from somewhere else. This suggestion that there are 3 different conflicting accounts, but they're not. They're perfectly compatible. And if you're an experienced reader of the Gospels, you'll see quote-unquote conflicting accounts from like your baseline atheists that suggest that they're conflicting accounts of different things, like the crucifixion of Jesus has different details per Gospel. Whatever Gospel you read, there's different details. These aren't conflicting accounts. They're just different accounts. Therefore, these different tellings of Paul's coming to Christ on the road to Damascus or seeing the vision don't conflict with each other, and they just give different details that we didn't know in the other.
Yeah, I just want to mention also, like when we're giving testimony or telling a story of something that actually happened to us, we don't always robotically recount everything verbatim, especially when we get bored or when we realize a better method or flow of thought in expressing the event. So he might have told this story 20 times, but it's only accounted for maybe 3 times in Acts. And maybe it was told slightly differently, but non-consequentially. maybe later on, the 19th or 20th time, might have told it more similarly, but not going to tell it verbatim.
Yeah, and again, to Paulogia's point, he doesn't even take Acts as good material, right? So he suggests in his short video that Paul had this thing, because it's tradition that Paul had this transfiguring moment on the road to Damascus, and he suggests that it was just Paul having his temporary psychotic vision, right? But all the accounts that we have traditionally from Acts is him and his companions both having this, or all having experienced, multiple companions and Paul. So I don't think that if we take those as serious tradition, at least, that the tradition does not suggest that Paul was the solo experiencer of this vision. It would have to be a mass delusion. And again, he would have delusional blindness. He's the only one that had delusional blindness. Kind of strange that his companions wouldn't, if they were all being deluded together, I should say, if they all saw this, but only one of them had hysterical blindness, then the tradition does not really line up with Paulogia's story about how Paul could have been a genuine believer without having genuinely experienced anything supernatural. But again, he rejects Acts, so it comes back to, we have different facts here in play, and the crux seems to be moving the things that we would say are at least factual traditions into the facts column for Paulogia. Point 10, Synoptic Gospel order is nuanced. So the order of what the Synoptic Gospels were in when they were written is nuanced. I understand, and I made the comparison that one of the reasons that, I made it sound like it was the whole reason, one of the reasons that the Synoptic Gospels are said to be in a certain order, Mark to Matthew to Luke, and then to John, is because of size. There are several reasons why that they're ordered that way by scholars today. Again, I might debate Matthew being before Mark. I'm not going to die on the hill. Mark could be before Matthew for some of the reasons that scholars suggest. Again, shared portions of them, added tradition, added pieces of them. Mark and Matthew are pretty similar for portions of them. Of course, there's added things in Matthew and there's different things in Mark. There's some grammatical syntax. I've heard theologians, I should say, because I'm not a Greek speaker, but I've heard theologians disagree with some of the Greek arguments about Mark being first in a more primitive and grammatically incorrect form of Greek, and that Matthew corrects those, quote unquote. I don't think that that's a shoe-in or an absolute, but I'm willing to say that, yeah, there's a lot of nuance into when these Gospels are written in order, but I would place them at a decently early date, and again, in any case, I would hold them as legitimate Christian tradition, not added legendary tradition. Move on. Point 11. The Gospel of John fragments are from the 2nd century, not the 1st. So if you remember, and Sebastian remembers because he's the man behind the book, so he takes these personal attacks from his research seriously, he suggested that we have a fragment from the Gospel of John from, like you said, 88 to 95 or something like that on the actual video itself.
Not 95. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So Paulogia said it's not. It's from later in the 1st to 2nd century. If you want to speak to that.
Sure. So even there's a debate when it comes to partially in textual criticism between Bart Ehrman and James White. Bart Ehrman, a known atheist, and James White is a Reformed theologian and also a professor. Which,
by the way, we'd suggest that debate to any of our people listening here. Bart Ehrman versus James White. You can look it up on YouTube and find it anywhere. I think he has 2 debates, but one of them is particularly good. Bart Ehrman even admits that it wasn't his best debate. He didn't do very well. But it's not like he didn't bring his arguments to bear. It's just James White gave a good Christian defense. So if you're an atheist and you're interested in people who would speak with Bart Ehrman in a serious way, more serious than me and Sebastian or Theodore, that know Greek and all that, I would suggest the debate between James White and Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman, in case you're not familiar, is I don't know that he considers himself an atheist. He keeps fluctuating on that, but certainly an ex-Christian textual critic who is very sympathetic to the views that Paulogia has, and he's all about textual criticism and late dates for books in the Bible and writings in the Bible. So I'd suggest that debate if you're interested in that textual criticism field.
Mm-hmm. So part of the argument in the debate was that fragment, he does say it's been 30, 40, 50 years after the original Gospel of John was written. The numbers I was seeing is 125 with plus or minus 25 years. I've also heard people who mentioned an even earlier time, around 90, 95 as well. That is why we lean more on the earlier accounts. So with all this together, I would say probably close to a year 100 would be a fair estimation.
Yeah, and in any case, we try to do our research, right? So I understand sometimes we pull from pretty conservative, super Christian sources, but even the Wikipedia article, which I don't think is particularly uber biased, usually they lean more towards the non-Christian side of things, sometimes not, but the Wikipedia article for P53? P52, this fragment of John, there's 2 of them, P52, that some claim that it comes earlier than 100, some claim that it comes from 100, it just has to do with how you mark the papyrus, right? So I don't think we were wrong. I guess we were optimistic. You were optimistic in the dating of it. So yes, we're coming from the Christian side. We're optimistically dating it, whereas Paulogia is not optimistically dating it. But in any case, hopefully we did our research, right? Point number 12. Rome made Christianity a lot more popular, and it's the most popular religion today. That's to be expected. It's a hallmark of regular religions. First of all, I had said that Christianity is not that popular today. I meant popular as in like acceptable. Yes, I understand that it's the largest religion by numbers. A lot of that's Catholicism, and Catholicism is like a state bloodline for most of the countries that people claim to be Catholic in. So I don't know that that's a great number, the classic number you've seen put out on population lists. But in any case, I just mean to say the culture right now is not very pro-traditional Christianity like it has been, especially in comparison to where it has been. So yes, I understand it's still a large belief. I believe that the church is going to continue to be large throughout the world, and whether it's in the U.S. or not. But speaking as an American, it's certainly not very popular in the workplace or in school to be talking about conservative Christian principles. We might want to talk about the fact that Christianity has a unique origin. And we've talked about this before, and we kind of mentioned it before, but it didn't have the power of the state from the beginning. And although Rome pushed it in the West, it equally grew to a pretty large minority in the East. And we've talked about this before. We talked about it on that reaction video. Paulogia didn't really... He kind of addressed it. He said that there are other minority religions that grew up in places that didn't have the power of the state. But what he doesn't really mention is that religions like Jainism, like Sikhism, or other minority religions within countries usually had the power of the state on a local level. So Sikhism, for example, had the local authorities that were pro-Sikh, right? So although they are a minority in India today and in the provinces as they were in the past, they had the power of the state town to town, city to city where they lived, right? So they actually did have the power of the sword and the state pushing them for the most part, whereas Christianity did not have communities like that in the Far East, and yet Christianity survived and thrived, even as a minority. So yes, I understand, obviously Christianity was pushed by the sword and by the state in Rome and other places in Europe and throughout the world today, but there are also places there where it's not pushed by the sword, where it is a minority religion, and I would say it's pretty unique on the lineup of religions on just its growth front, let alone all of its origins.
Mm-hmm. And the belief system were consistent both in the Roman Empire eventually when it came under the state control, and then in East in Sasanian and also even Mongolia areas when it spread under the Church of the East. So minorities there, consistent beliefs, as in the Roman Empire, where supposedly was influenced by the state.
Yep, and I'm going to say point 13 is basically the exact same point. Put it twice, I guess. I had sarcastically said there are 100 religions like Christianity, i.e. there's not 100 religions like Christianity. He suggested there are 100 religions just like Christianity, that is just like the origins of Zoroastrianism or Manichaeism or Islam or any of these. I would say the contrast between a monotheistic religion and a polytheistic religion's origins are usually vast. Like the difference between the origins of Hinduism and the origins of Christianity are huge, right? Hinduism and Greek mythology and Roman mythology, all the conglomerating different sources that all have to be crammed into one in like the late 1800s for Hinduism and for Greek and Roman mythology are really non-comparable to the origins of monotheistic religions like Islam, Christianity, Judaism, etc. And amongst monotheistic, one-person pushed religions, Christianity is also pretty unique in its origins from prior Judaism, holding those scriptures to still be true, and in who propagated it. Again, without the power of the state, typically. It wasn't one single propagator, it was multiple propagators all coming from the same origin. Again, I think it is objectively unique compared to Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, Islam, Mormonism, whatever you might put out there. So I understand it has a holy book, and it has churches and buildings, and the adherents have rites of initiation and whatever else, right? So I understand that those things are similar, but that's just, every religion is like that. So it's kind of unfair to say that Christianity is not unique amongst religions because it is a religion. It's unique amongst religions on the things that it differs in. Now, I understand I have rose-colored glasses on and that I am a Christian, so of course I'm going to say it's unique, but we said at the beginning, we are Christians. Last point is he ends his response by saying it's all about determining facts from fiction. Claims to witnesses of the supernatural that the Bible has, they claim to have witnesses that witnessed supernatural things, don't matter if they didn't actually witness those things. Well, I'm in agreement. Yes, you can claim whatever you want about having seen supernatural things, but it doesn't matter if you didn't actually see the supernatural things or they didn't actually happen. I think the point we were making at the end of our response video is that Christianity claims to have witnesses to these supernatural things in a time when people could have gone to those witnesses and tried to verify that these people saw these supernatural things. So I can say right now that in the 700s, aliens invaded Rome, and 500,000 people saw these aliens, and they destroyed many cities in Spain or something like that, right? And I'm just pulling that out of my butt. I understand that that's not a reputable source, and nobody has to agree with me there. But at the time that the Bible's authors were writing, they were writing to people in that day of events that would have taken place in that day, close enough. So these claims that aliens came in and 500,000 people saw them, equivalently, Jesus was raised from the dead, the apostles performed miracles, and 3,000 came on the first day of Pentecost, and others came afterwards, and they saw the risen Christ, and the dead were rising out of tombs, and all this would have been checkable by those who were hearing these stories back in that day. So quite a bold assertion of the Christian authors, the Christian movement, to be suggesting that supernatural things happened to many witnesses at that time, as opposed to some past time where nobody can verify. So that's all I've got to say there.
Even in Luke, of course, if you accept or not accept,
Luke.
Another point of contention, he states his purpose in his letter, which any person in his time could have grabbed. This is not correct. He states his purpose. Many have undertaken to draw up on account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilos, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Again, he's making a claim for he is making a claim for evidence, to citing sources, calling eyewitnesses. What you were saying is someone could have grabbed this. It's like, this is all fabricated back then. Like, these witnesses are not good witnesses, etc., etc.
And I mean, we have opponents to Christianity today, so you might say, oh, well, there wasn't modern atheists. There wasn't a billion men like Paulogia or Matt Dillahunty or whoever else attacking Christianity like they do today back then, and so they weren't having the same critiques back then. Yes, they weren't often having the same atheistic critiques that they have today, but there were a buttload of people who opposed Christianity. So there was many resources being funneled into trying to disprove and attack the Christian belief. So it's not like it didn't have opponents trying to pick at these claims at the time, right? The Jews were obviously vehemently against Christianity, those who were unbelieving, and so they would have had every motivation to try to disprove some of its claims at the time contemporary. Again, after the fact, it's hard to go back in history and say that, talk about witnesses that are no longer alive. But again, at the contemporary time, the Jews would have been able to attack it pretty fiercely, and they would have had all the motivation to. Same for the Romans, because the Christians were trying to usurp state, essentially, in their opinion, and not serve Caesar in the way they wanted. So they also had, of course, the motivation to attack Christians. So any last comments, Theodore or Sebastian, on this response?
I think maybe to bring it full circle back to presuppositions, the beginning few minutes up to like the 5-minute mark or something in Paulogia's response video said he wants to see if there's a plausible non-miraculous explanation. And that's just based on his presupposition or bias toward presumably naturalism, materialism, despite no logical scientific explanation for a biogenesis or genesis or the beginning of anything without first some sort of God existing. Then another thing he said, legends don't need to be true to explain the actual data we have. Then just want to emphasize that that doesn't mean that the naturalistic or materialistic explanation is more true or even true at all. Because obviously as Christians, we believe ism, Christianity, is the most true and is the truth, which we have found our cause.
And serve the Lord Jesus Christ. Thanks for sounding up, Theodore. I've been Michael, the man behind the machine, and to my right, your left has been
Sebastian, the bookkeeper.
I think actually it's right. You're right on the screen now. That was flipped when we're on this call. And to my virtual front is
Theodore, under the PC, person of Christ.
All right. It's quite the epithet you got there. Until we talk about something completely different next time, thanks for listening. If you want to see the rest of our episodes, you can go to foundcause.podbean.com. Actually, other way around, and download them all for listening pleasure, including this one. But if you want to see our beautiful faces and see our videos, of course, we're on youtube.com. Search us up, Found Cause. We're on facebook.com/Found Cause. We're also on iTunes, Spotify, and everywhere you find your podcast. So until next time, bye-bye.